Hmm. Hi there. I don't know how many of you are with me because I can't find that part of the screen, but I'm glad that those of you are with me. It's a rainy day here in Bethesda, Maryland. I hope you're all well where you are. I have a bunch of slides that I'm going to share with you, but I want to start out by saying that I'm really glad you're here. The thing about interviewing is that it's part of so much that we do in life, whether you're a podcast host or not, whether you moderate panels, whether you are in charge of putting conferences together or whatever it may be. That's what we tend to think of when we think of interviewing. But we interview people all the time. We interview people when we are trying to either get a job or give someone a job. We interview them when we're doing performance reviews. Sometimes we interview our kids. So there's all kinds of ways that interviewing helps us if our skills are good. But oftentimes what I hear is people whose interview skills aren't as good as they could be. And part of the reason for this is that we think of interviewing as sort of an art, that you either know how to do it or you don't. And there is a very small percentage of it that is like that. but most of the time it isn't. Most of the skills that you need for interviewing are actually skills that can be attained, skills that can be trained and improved and perfected someday, I guess. We know lots of celebrity interviewers, and oftentimes celebrity interviewers are asked to interview people without the relevant skills that they need. The difference is that when you're a celebrity, they're counting on the fact that most people will want to hear what you have to say as much as they want to hear what other people have to say. So you don't have to try as hard to ask good questions because people are interested in what you're doing and in what you're saying just as much as anything else. So we're going to talk a little bit about, for the rest of us who are not celebrities, how to get better at interviewing skills so you can get really interesting interviews out of just about everybody, not just celebrities. That's the most important part. The thing is that for the most part, people do interviewing by trial and error. They ask yes or no questions, or they make statements, and they hope that the guest is good enough to expand on their answer instead of just saying yes or no or maybe. This backfires. I wouldn't say often, but it does backfire. There have been times when I have made a statement instead of asking a question, and on live radio with thousands of people listening, the guest says, "What's your question?" It's super embarrassing. When you do things like that, it's called interviewing by accident. You're basically, if you get a good interview out of the other person, you can't really explain why that's happened, and you probably can't replicate it for sure because you don't know what's gone right, in just as much as you don't know what's gone wrong. There's also this theory that you can interview by magic, like when something goes right, it's magic. Um, and this is like when we think that someone is just great at interviewing and they were born that way, and or maybe you got a guest where you had very good rapport with, and you think, well, there was chemistry there, it was magic. It's not magic. Great interviews happen for a reason, reasons that we can track, reasons that we can measure, things that we can understand, because interviewing is a skill. And I want to show you this comment that was made by someone I interviewed on the NPR program 1A. He said, a smart interviewer is like caffeine. She made me smarter than I am. Now, the reason I really like this comment is because I am trying to make guests smarter than they are. I'm trying to be so good at my job that I actually make people do better than they thought they could or have done in other interviews. This is super important if you host a podcast, because oftentimes we're interviewing someone who is also being interviewed on a number of other shows, on a number of other podcasts. So with a million podcasts out there and millions of downloads, if yours is one of 20 interviews that person is doing, how do you grow your audience except by making your interview with that person the best one? When you do a great interview with somebody, not only is that guest more likely to share it, but when people hear it, they're more likely to share it as well. The fans of that person. If you interview a really well-known person, you might get a bump, but it will be a small bump and it won't translate into loyalty for your show unless you've done a good job. That's how interviews, and really, really great interviews, end up growing your audience, is because no matter who you're talking to, the people who like that person are going to come because yours is the interview they want to hear. They know that they're going to hear things there that they won't hear anywhere else. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to do that. And the course that I'm leading, so I created a training course. It's 8 weeks long. And it mirrors the kind of training that I do for public media and have done for well over a decade. The difference with this online training course is I was actually able to go into more depth than I often get to do when I'm training public radio people. Oftentimes when I've been training in public radio, I get a couple days or a few hours and to check back in over the course of their training. With the course, I could literally put everything in there that I thought about. And I created a workbook that allows you to sort of recreate as you're getting ready for an interview, exactly the practices and exercises and things that are really going to help you get good at this. And the good thing about this method is that, look, I've been a deadline as a journalist for most of my career. I'm not going to teach you anything that's going to take a huge amount of time. It may take more time when you first get started and get used to it, but in the end, it will save you time because it is a system of interviewing. This is basically me saying to you, interviewing is a skill. It can be learned and it can be practiced and it can be reproduced. That's the important part. Now, when you talk about an interview, here's the course outline for it. When you talk about an interview, you can break it apart into some component parts. And one of them that we don't often think about is choosing the right guest. A great interviewer knows when a guest isn't going to work. So a great interviewer already has a system in place to recognize when someone will be a good guest and when someone will not be that great. So one of the things I walk you through is learning how to recognize who's a good guest and who isn't. I mean, there's no reason to set yourself up for failure by choosing a guest where you're either going to waste your time because you have to dump the interview, or you're going to just reproduce exactly what someone else has said. There are people who are great talkers, but they will end up saying the exact same thing in every interview they do. Why? Because that's how they've been trained. And that's kind of a waste of your time, because it's highly unlikely that, unless you're super good at interviewing, that you're going to get something out of them that's unexpected. I want to make you that good. So the second thing as we go through that is to prepare for your interview. And again, there's steps that you can take. And I have created a workbook that will walk you through preparation for your interview. Just boom, 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 boom. A checklist, kind of like the checklist manifesto that Atul Gawande used to revolutionize healthcare. I want to revolutionize interview prep by giving you a checklist that will just walk you through the steps and make this easy and make it something you can replicate every time. And again, in general, it takes me an hour or two to prepare for a lot of interviews, certainly the ones where I'm talking to an author, or often the people that you're going to talk to on a podcast. The third section is going to be ask great questions. That's kind of self-explanatory. Then handling difficult guests. Sometimes the difficult guests are not the ones that you might expect. The most difficult guest, I think, for me, is often the politician. But you could expand that out and say the CEO. And the reason that these are difficult guests is because, again, they're trained. They have been coached in what to say, which means that no matter what question you ask them, they're going to give you an answer that they already have prepared, making it sound boring and stiff and not spontaneous and not conversational. And they also rarely answer the question you've asked. For a number of reasons, the one I just said, they prepare for certain responses, but also because they've been trained that if you ask a question they don't want to answer, they can get around it and still sound friendly and charming. Handling difficult guests is something, again, that can be trained. You can learn to recognize which guest is on the microphone with you and immediately know, okay, this is a wallflower. This is somebody who I need to pull them out. I need to draw out all of the interesting stories that they have to tell me. And here's how they do it. I'm already prepared for that. Okay, this is somebody who runs on and on and on. I recognize that and I know exactly how to handle it. These are things that you can learn. The final lesson is going to be wrap it up. In learning how to end an interview is, again, kind of a skill. And think of it this way. When we're having a conversation with people, we know through research that one of the things that prevents a lot of people from striking up conversations with strangers is because they're afraid of how it will end. They're afraid they'll get stuck in the conversation. They're afraid they won't know how to walk away. And it's kind of the same thing with interviews. Ending interviews can be a little bit awkward. And I can walk you through how to make this natural and really make it feel as though the listener is sitting in and listening in on a friendly conversation between two very, very smart people that's engaging and leading to an end where you can very naturally close it out and give their listener a feeling of closure. This is super important in interviews. You never want a listener to leave feeling like there's still balls up in the air. That can raise tension in your listeners, and it can make them subconsciously be nervous about coming back and listening again, because that feeling of being unresolved is very uncomfortable. And you got to make sure that you resolve everything and bring closure at the end. I want to talk a little bit about the NPR style of training, because NPR does it very well. And in public radio, you get trained. Very often out in the commercial world, there's not a lot of training in how to do interviews, which surprises me because this should be something that everyone is doing. NPR refers to interviews as two ways, and you get why, right? There's two people, there's having a conversation between two people, but the other reason it's called a two-way is because there's two-way communication. There's an exchange going on. According to NPR, a good two-way, the best two ways are conversational. They have a very clear focus or goal. They have a logical structure, which is something we will be talking about in the training course a lot. They're memorable. Can a listener walk away from that interview and retell some of the stories that they've heard, retell some of the details that they've heard? And the last thing, which I think is super important, is NPR says the best interview strikes a balance between preparation, knowing your topic, and spontaneity. In fact, one senior editor at NPR said that two ways are like jazz. They involve improvisation within a structure. This is a challenge, and it requires a lot of practice, but you can absolutely get to this point where it feels your interview is sparking. It feels like it's very spontaneous, but what people don't see is the structure underneath it, the storytelling that you're doing over the course of your interview that gives that interview a framework, that gives it a beginning and a middle and an end. Human beings are absolutely primed, biologically primed, to look for stories. And we will find them. And whether you like it or not, people are looking for those stories, even subconsciously in your interviews. They're trying to figure out the beginning and the middle and the end, because that is what human beings do. And that's one of the things I will train you to do, is that you set that framework up in advance, and you have that framework set so that when you're actually in the interview, you can kind of forget the framework a little bit and let the interview progress. Now let's move on to this first section here. Sorry if I'm talking fast. I get super passionate about this subject, and there is so much to tell you. The first course in this online course that I'm teaching is Choose the Right Guest. And there's a number of things here. The big picture, who's in my neighborhood? This is something we have to talk about, which is diversity of your sources. From the last data that we have, which is 2019, we know that over 80% of guests on talk shows and news magazines are white and male. We don't have the data for podcasts. There's over 1 million podcasts out there. Nobody is tracking that, but we can kind of guess that even if podcasts are a little better, the vast majority of guests are white and male. Unless you believe that white males are worth listening to 85% of the time, and everyone else is only worth listening to 16% of the time, then those statistics are a problem, right? But it's a problem because we all have implicit bias. We all feel more comfortable talking to and reaching out to people who are similar to ourselves. That is human. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's human. And so there's ways that I can teach you and sources that I can send you to where you can find these guests that are going to bring you new voices and brand new information and new perspectives. This is super important, not only because people are becoming very conscious of the media that they consume, and they don't want media that is 100% looks and sounds the same, but also because those new perspectives and experiences that you hear from people who are not like yourself are exciting. They're new and they're unheard of, and they're surprising and oftentimes insightful. And they might be things that you'll think, wow, I never thought about that before. That's not the only thing that goes into a right guest. There's ways that you can make sure that that guest is a good talker. Sometimes when we hear someone's interview, and this is quite true on NPR as well, we can make someone sound good through very, very skilled editing. So there's ways that there's methods and strategies that you can do to make sure you've got the right guest. You don't want to talk to the same person that everybody else is talking to, but it might be okay if those other interviews have all been bad. And a lot of them are, Laura. Oh, the edit. Yeah, the edit. You can make somebody sound really good. So that's shift 2 is where do I look? There's new things. The red flags is what you can spot immediately. And I just need to train your eye so that you get ready to find the yellow and the red flags, and you just know what you're prepared for. And then finally, we're going to talk about the pre-interview, which is not something that a lot of people do outside of not just journalism, but frankly, I don't think a lot of people do it outside of public media. But the pre-interview is super important. And we're not talking about something that takes a long time. Most pre-interviews should take 10 or 15 minutes, but a pre-interview gives you so much important information that I'm going to walk you through exactly how to do your pre-interview and what kind of information that you need, why it's important that when someone starts to get passionate or emotional in that short phone call, which happens before the interview, why you need to stop them. The reason is that most people have one truly great retelling of a story, and you want that to happen while you're recording. I know it's tempting when you're on that pre-interview call and they start saying something really interesting and you're into the conversation, you just want to hear the end of the story. It's tempting to go ahead and listen. But if you do that, they're going to be retelling it when they're on your podcast or at your conference or wherever it may be. You want that first telling to be while the mics are open. So these are all things that you learn during the course. In fact, this is the very first lesson in the online course. Oh, there's Oprah. She gets to choose the right guest because she gets any guest that she wants. Then we're going to move on to prepping for your interview. Prepping can waste your time, or it can use it very, very effectively and efficiently. This is one of the places in preparation for one interview where I often do the most work with hosts, because you can really waste a lot of time looking at the wrong things. And the other part is that you have to make sure that your mindset is correct, meaning that you have to make sure you have a focus for the interview. Sometimes you can call this the thesis statement, or here, the big why. Why are you doing this interview? And the answer can't be because this author has a book coming out. That's why they're doing the interview. Why are you doing it? And in order for you to do this, you need to know what's different about your show or your conference or your panel discussion. What is different about it? Meaning, what is my show about? And you have to be super careful here, because if it can be about anything, usually that means it's about nothing. So you have to decide, what is it that you do? And then how does this guest fit into that vision of your show? That is the big why. Why am I doing the show? Why does this guest fit into that vision? And sort of walk you through that. When you're talking about horizontal to vertical, very often we have a tendency, because Google has changed all of our brains and how they work, we have a tendency to go broad in our preparation. We just keep clicking on links. One link takes to another link, to another link. We go through the Wikipedia page and just pull out every interesting tidbit. And so we get this broad expanse of interesting things to talk about, rather than vertical, going deep. And we're going to talk quite a bit in preparation about how it is that you go deep, how you follow these threads all the way down. And this is another thing that we talk about in terms of asking great questions. There's this technique that detectives are taught, and people in law enforcement, and especially in like the CIA, they're taught the funnel technique, which is where you start somebody out in a broad area and you just keep asking narrowing follow-up questions until you get to a nugget, a truly interesting nugget of truth down there at the bottom. This is what we talk about when we're going horizontal to vertical. If you spread out your preparation and learn all kinds of small, interesting tidbits about something, you haven't fully prepared to do that funnel. You haven't prepared to follow threads all the way down, because they'll start giving you tidbits and you don't recognize them. That's one thing we'll talk about here. The timeline principle, which is to create a chronological history. I can't tell you how many times this has saved me in an interview where I simply spent a few minutes and sort of create a chronology of a guest's life. And it really does take only a few minutes. 2001, they did this. 2002, the first book came out, et cetera, et cetera. This helps in a number of ways, not least of which is that guests don't always remember the dates. Sometimes they'll say, well, that was back in, and they'll spend a minute or so searching for a date, and then you can jump in and go, are you talking about your first book, which came out in 2001? This isn't the only reason that you do this, but it's a really good one. One of the main reasons you do it is because of shift number 4, which is to master the story arc. And what I want you to do is start thinking about your interviews the way that Pixar thinks about movies. I want you to become a storyteller through your interviews. That is what separates great interviewers from all the rest of them, the mediocre and average interviewers. That's not who you want to be. Storytelling is just phenomenally powerful. And not only is storytelling powerful, but when you can match storytelling with hard data and facts, that combination of those two things is just incredible. That's the kind of preparation you need to do in order to create what NPR calls driveway moments. I don't know if you've heard the phrase driveway moments. It is in the dictionary at this point, or at least Urban Dictionary. But a driveway moment is associated with public radio because what would happen is people would be listening to the radio in their cars. They pull into their driveway and they would sit in their car because they had to hear the end of the story. That's what a driveway moment is. You're stuck in your car or in the parking lot of your work because you just have to hear the end. That's the kind of interview you can do. But you need a beginning and a middle and an end. You need to learn how to tell stories. And the final shift here is to find the Easter egg, which is set yourself up to be surprised. Now, you might think this is counterintuitive. How do I prepare for surprise? But you absolutely can. And your preparation isn't done until you kind of know what the surprise is. This is part of your storytelling here. This is one setup that when you're doing something that is more logical, like someone who has written a book about, especially a helping book or economics or business, anything like that, you basically set them up with the structure of problem, solution, complication, future. Complications show up at every step of this, but this is one example of a storytelling structure that you can set up for your interviews. What is the problem? What are the complications along the way that lead you to a solution? And then what's coming next? What happens in the future? This is one of the oldest possible story structures that you can come up. I'm talking about in human history, but because it is familiar to people, it's powerful because of that. And believe me, the vast majority of people will have no idea that all this structure is behind the walls of the house you're building. This is all going on in the background. All they'll hear is a fantastic interview, and they'll wonder how you do it every week. And this is how you do it. This is that framework that's going on behind it. Okay. The next thing that we'll talk about is to ask great questions. I've already recorded most of the webinars, most of the courses for this series. And this is one of the longest ones. It's because asking great questions is the heart of what you do. It's what an interview is. All the other stuff is important. It's going to make your interviews great. It's going to set them apart. But what truly sets it apart are those great questions. And all this preparation, all of the thinking that you do and the goals that you create, they're designed to increase the strength and power of your questions. So this is a lot of what we will focus on. When you are working on improving your interviews, you can take it on two different levels. The macro level is better stories. Macro. That's what we sort of cover when we're talking about your preparation. The micro level is better questions. Those micro better questions lead to the better stories. So this is where we get to asking better questions. And there's a reminder here on my script that I'm supposed to remind you that this particular webinar is an introduction to the course that I've designed. The course is 8 weeks long. Each session in the master series focuses on a different aspect. So like the very first one is the right guest. The second one is your preparation, etc. And then once a month, that's 8 weeks. So for two months, once a month, I'll hold a session like this. That's live, when everyone who's in the master series can come in and bring me your questions, bring me your issues. Tell me what happened in an interview that you had, and get advice, and we can discuss. Maybe there's a question that you had after going through your particular session for that week, and we'll have time to go through all of that once a month. And then also I created a workbook, because some of this stuff you can just download it and reprint it. For example, the story structure one, I created a page that just helps you create the story structure for your interviews. You can print that as many times as you want and use it every time for your interviews. The same thing with your guest prep. There's a sheet in there that will walk you through how to prepare to interview a guest. And again, all you need to do is print it and download it, and then print it and use it every single time you're preparing for an interview. It makes it super, super simple. The course itself is also found at Webinar Ninja, and it's super easy to find. You're going to find it at the same place. If you look at the top of your screen, it should say CelesteHeadleyMedia.webinarninja.com. That's where you can sign up for the master series, which is called Transform Your Interviews. That's why we're here today. That's why I'm here today. But let's walk you through this particular session, which is Ask Great Questions. So shift 1, less is more. This is really about the more information that you put into a question, the more the guest will leave out. So when you acknowledge that you're bringing someone on because they're an expert in some field, and they are, whatever that field is, you need to let them be an expert at it. So shorter questions from you is going to mean, in general, a longer question from the guest. And there's a number of ways to do this. For example, you have to avoid questions that start with verbs. Is this the best book you've ever written? Should you be reaching a broader audience? Can you? The questions that start with verbs, they're not just closed-ended questions, meaning that they don't just elicit 3 answers, yes, no, or maybe, but they're also generally carry value judgments. And we'll walk through how you change those questions that begin with verbs into questions that begin with interrogatives. And that's where we get to shift number 2, leave it open. Open-ended questions that start with the 3 W's and how. There's 6 of them technically: who, what, where, when, why, and how. 3 of them are better than others. I'll explain why when we get into it. But open-ended questions, they're hard to ask sometimes, but there is really, really strong scientific evidence about why they work. And I'm not kidding you. People have been studying question asking for decades now. And you can imagine why, right? I mean, not only do we use them in terms of law enforcement and in terms of foreign relations, we use questions in terms of diplomacy. There's all kinds of governmental reasons and security reasons why we need to know better about security questions. But businesses and corporations have been investing into questions as well for a very, very long time. Not only so they can ask their customers better questions, but that's so they can do the job interview better, for example. All of the different places in which questions come into play, including meetings at work. We have a lot of research on them. I have studied questions not only from the point of view of a journalist, but from the point of view of a sociologist and a psychologist. In other words, what questions will actually unlock the openness of a brain and what tends to shut it down or put it into defensive mode. I've studied them from the law enforcement point of view, from the sales point of view. We do have a lot of information. The third one is break new ground. And again, you really want to make sure you're asking questions that the person has not answered before, or at least asking them in a new way than they've been asked before. This is something that I don't think I'm fully successful in an interview unless I've done it. So, and again, this isn't an art. This is a skill. Learning to ask questions that have not been asked before we think it's a talent that you either have or you don't. It is not. Like everything else I'm going to be training in this course, it is a skill that you can learn. And then you can be admired because you are the one person who knows how to do this particular thing. Get specific. There's the TED strategy of doing this, not TED as in the videos, but TED as in tell, explain, describe. And we'll walk through exactly how to use this so that you can get your guest to be describing exactly what they saw, colors, sounds. The purpose for this is that you want them to be remembering very well. Number one, you want to put them back into the place to spur their memory, spark their memory, but it's also going to bring your listeners along. This is something I'm sure if you listen to Public Radio at all, you know we're really good at this. In fact, we get teased about it on Saturday Night Live all the time, is creating an atmosphere, recreating a scene. And you can do that simply through your questions by sparking their memory. And then finally, it's follow that car, which is about follow-up questions. And frankly, the suggestion from research scientists is that you ask more follow-up questions than regular questions. In fact, they want you to ask 5 follow-up questions for every one, regular question that you ask, which really cuts down on the number of questions that you have to ask, because if you in a regular interview would ask 20 questions, well, if you replace some of those questions with follow-ups, then you may only have to write 5 or 6 questions. Couple things. I do not suggest that you write your questions in advance. There's a number of reasons for this. They're all extremely important, but not least of which is that when you write your questions in advance, you have this tendency to follow the script, especially if you start to get nervous. So I really suggest that you do not do that. So Matt says it's hard to know what's original and breaking new ground for guests who've done so many interviews. And I totally agree with you. I mean, I have been interviewing presidents and celebrities and CEOs for a super long time. And it can be very difficult. And in the end, you have to come up with a system so that even if you are asking a question that they've asked before, you have either 2 of things can make it different. Number one, you can ask it in a way or bring out a different aspect of it that they've never been asked that way before. Or 2, you can lead up in the storytelling to where the context that surrounds that question gives it a new perspective. They've been answering it from this perspective 50 times, and you're going to twist it around and answer it from this way. And I'll give you an example. I was interviewing the author John Irving, and he is notorious for hating to do interviews. Notorious. He hates them. He hates his book tours. So and you get warned about them by his press. So when he came in for his interview, I did such a careful reading of his book that by the time we got to this moment, I said, listen, I want to read this paragraph to you. And I know you've heard this a billion times before, but I think you are writing about yourself. And he scoffed. He was like, ugh, and rolled his eyes because he has heard that a million times before. And I was like, yeah, but stay with me and let me give you my evidence. And I walked him through one by one by one. And he was completely stunned. And he's like, I think you're right. I think I was writing about myself. And by the time we got to that interview, he was so pleased. He went out and told his PR person, okay, I will come back and do this interview with her. I will do that. Because he was impressed by how close the reading is. And this is when I was doing a 4-hour daily live show. So we're not talking about prep that took me hours and hours and hours to do. I didn't have the time to do that. This is when I was hosting The Takeaway. So it's totally possible, and I can absolutely teach you how to do that. The same is true of, I'll explain this in a moment. Same is true. I did an interview with Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison is also another person who was notorious for hating to do interviews. She cut them off. She walked out of people's interviews. She hated them. She sat and did an interview with me for an hour. And when the engineer came in and said, "I'm sorry, we have to use the studio. We'll have to cut this off," she said, "Oh no." Shocker to everybody. So these are things that you can learn how to do. It's not, there's nothing incredibly special about me. These are just things and tactics that I've learned how to do. So we will be talking a little bit about the Sawatsky technique. What I am bringing in this course is not just all of my own experience, but all of the training that I have done over the 21, 22 years that I have been in public media, and training with incredible people like David Kando and others. John Sawatsky was known as the question man. He trained the ESPN anchors for a long time because their off-field interviews used to be terrible. He was so good at his job as an investigative reporter that he once outed a spy. And he said, "We're playing on their turf. We're generalists interviewing people who know their subject, and we don't. If we fight them head on, we lose. They know more than we do. If we turn it around, if we make them prove everything, we turn our weakness into strength. Don't fight their superior knowledge, use it." And there are ways, again, that you can use this, and it just doesn't take that much time. I also want to be able to go into the science, and this is something we do in the very first course of the 8 weeks, is to go into the science of questioning, how you open up someone's mind. For example, here's a perfect example. There have been a couple clinical studies that have shown that if you allow someone to feel proud right at the beginning of a conversation, it actually opens them up, and it lasts for quite some time, that they're more open to new ideas and they're more opening to hearing other things. So if you begin interviews by just taking a moment and finding a way to let that guest feel proud of something. What's the best thing that's happened to you in the past week? What are you most proud of in 2020 so far? If you give them that moment, we know neurologically speaking, cognitively speaking, that it opens up their neural pathways. These are ways that you can use the science that we have at your disposal. And again, you're missing an opportunity if you see interviewing as an art instead of something that can be studied and learned. Another thing I wanted to talk to you about is this fact that becoming a better questioner actually does a lot of great things for your brain as well. We happen to know, and there's a great piece in the Harvard Business Review about asking better questions. We happen to know that as you work on your questioning, it becomes a virtuous cycle, that it actually does good things for your emotional intelligence, your problem solving, your creativity as well. So all in all, it's just a better way. This also work to close the interview. No, not necessarily. I mean, it can't, certainly when you close an interview, it's good to have the guest feeling good. But if you've given them a really great interview and allowed them to feel like you've asked questions they've never been asked before, et cetera, they're going to feel good. I say this not only as an interviewer, but an interviewee who's been interviewed a lot. We have about 15 minutes left, and I am going to leave room for questions at the end. I wanted to remind you that the reason I'm doing this particular webinar is because I've created an online training course. This is one of the benefits of the pandemic, is that I have been stuck at home. All of my speaking gigs were canceled, so I finally had the time to do something that I've been meaning to do for at least 5 years, which is to create a course to make the exact same training I offer to public media folks available to everybody. I have been working on it for months and months and months, and it's very exciting for me because it's finally going to be opened up for registrations this week. It is an 8-week course. We're walking through every single portion of it, step by step by step. It includes a workbook that you can download and then reprint as many times as you want. And then once a month, I'll lead a discussion just like this one, because I want to be able to answer your questions and get into the nitty gritty of what it is that you're going through, perhaps, or things that may be particular to you. When I teach interviewing, I'm not teaching you rules per se. I'm teaching you principles. Every interview is going to be different. So rules won't necessarily serve you, but there are principles that if you follow them, you will be rewarded, and principles that if you violate them, you'll pay a price. Okay, so this is going about the difficult guests. And you may have already seen some of these people before. The wallflower, that's someone that, is difficult to draw out or is giving you not very interesting answers to things. Then there's the windbag, that's somebody who just keeps talking. And this also includes sometimes people who are pretty self-important. And when they talk, they're talking about, well, when I was leading a corporation in London, we did such an important case and the windbag. You can get around them. You just have to learn how to crack out of their patterns. Everybody gets into a pattern, and interviewees and guests get into those patterns as well. This happens so much in conferences. I don't know how many conferences you've been to where the panel discussion is so boring that you end up staring at your phone. It is incredibly rare to find someone who is good at moderating a panel. Super rare. But that could be you, because you will recognize these people. The third one is the debater. And again, I'm sure you've come up against these people, even if it's somebody just in your regular life who just always wants to debate everything or feels like they know the right information about everything. There's the misinformed. Now, this one's interesting, especially in the particular age that we're in, which is somebody who is regularly saying stuff that is not factually correct. If it's too much, if they're doing this too much, then they're not the right guest. That's something that we're going to talk about. It's not enjoyable for the listener to hear you constantly correcting a guest, and it's irresponsible to let somebody go on the air and just say things that are factually inaccurate. So there's civil and polite and friendly and charming ways to get around someone who's saying stuff that is incorrect without arguing with them. And believe me, I have done this so many times I can't even tell you. One of the things I talk about in my book, We Needed to Talk, is I was hosting a daily show in Atlanta when the shooting happened in South Carolina. And we had to have a week-long discussion about the Confederate flag. Now, I'm a mixed race woman. 2 generations removed from slavery. Obviously, I have strong feelings about the Confederate flag, and they're not positive. But I had discussions with members of the Sons of the Confederate Veterans and other people who very strongly believe in that flag. And there are ways to do that where you end the conversation. You're not approving of what that person is saying, but you have kept them honest and you've kept it factual and correct. And you can do that while still being, again, not argumentative, not angry about it. It's going to help your cortisol levels and your heart rate anyway. You don't want to get upset about that stuff all the time. The final one is the weed lover. And we get this all the time where you get somebody on who's an expert and they're constantly telling you not just that there was a study, but the study happened in 2002. And here were the particular authors, and it was at the UC Berkeley. And they just get into the weeds. They just are constantly giving you too much detail that is going to make your listeners turn it off. I mean, here's the thing. We know that almost a majority of listeners don't make it to the end of podcasts. And the same is true of conferences. I mean, you've all been there and tuned out when something has become boring. So this is the goal, is you never want to be boring. You don't want people to tune out. You want your driveway moment. You want to keep the listener or the audience engaged from the beginning all the way to the end. That's the goal. And that absolutely can happen for you. It is a system, and you can learn that system and sort of be ahead of those others. The picture here of Gene Simmons is because he is notoriously a difficult guest. If you get the chance to find the interview that he did with Terry Gross on Fresh Air, I would listen to it. It's not particularly informative, but it's extremely instructive because she handles him like a champ. He gives her just one of the worst interviews ever. Almost every other interview would crumble, but Terry Gross, unafraid, handles it so capably and professionally that it's become an object lesson. And I probably listened to that interview 15 times just to learn from her and how she did that. Okay, we've got 10 minutes left and I want to leave 5 minutes for questions. So let's talk. This happens every time because I get super excited about this subject. So wrapping it up, toppling your idols, and this is the part when you're editing. And sometimes, okay, so in journalism, they sometimes call this killing puppies. And it is because sometimes your very favorite part of an interview has to go because it doesn't fit the storytelling, because it goes off on a tangent. The show is called Fresh Air, and the interview she was doing was with Gene Simmons. If you Google it, Joe, Terry Gross, Gene Simmons, you'll find it. So sometimes, yeah, your favorite item has to go, but there's other ways to repurpose that favorite item through social media. You can turn it into a pull quote or other things that you can do with it so you don't have to lose it completely. That's one of the beauties that we have now of social media. We didn't have that in the past. Fading into the background. The best hosts and interviewers in the world don't shine a spotlight on themselves. They shine a spotlight on their guest. That's what makes the storytelling compelling. It's what makes the guest happy and makes the guest more likely to want to come back. It's what makes the fans of that guest more likely to drive people to your specific interview. And it's what makes people feel as though they've had a really interesting conversation with an interesting person. Ethics, the pesky things. Here's the thing about ethics is oftentimes we assume that they are unwritten rules. We assume that sort of everyone's following the same ethics, but you have to make them explicit because that's not always true. And frankly, as an interviewee, this has really bitten people in the butt when they have done an interview with me and it was approved as an audio only, but we were on camera on Zoom, for example, and then they couldn't use the interview, they couldn't use that video because they didn't get approval for it. There's ethics here. And then finally, pull quotes. We'll be talking about how to recognize a great pull quote and what makes a good pull quote and what doesn't. Okay, so I want to say thank you. We've got about 7 minutes left. There's a few last things I want to say before we go to some questions. I mean, number one, a reminder. If you look up at the top in your browser window, you'll see it says celesteheadleymedia.webinarninja.com. I'm taking registrations for the course. Most of the videos are already up. I'm recording the last two, I think this weekend. And the course is 8 weeks long, and what it allows me to do is do the kind of in-depth training, frankly, I've never even been able to do through NPR or any other venue. It allows me to go super in-depth into every one of these particular topics, finding the right guest, asking great questions. I was really able to drill down in a vertical way on each one of these subjects and bring you not only the benefit of my wisdom, but all of the incredible trainers that I've had over the course of my 20-year career. I've kept notes on every training session I ever went to. I've tried out all of it to make sure that everything works. And then I've combined it with the best science that we have in terms of the way people are psychologically, cognitively, neurologically in interviews, and how you get people to open up. I'm super excited. I've been able to create a course that I think is going to be absolutely the gold standard when it comes to interviewing. I don't know if you're like me, but when I have gone looking for other interview training, there's really not a lot of training out there that actually goes in depth into the interview. There's plenty of training that sort of glosses over it and gives you a broad view of it. There's plenty of training that's going to repeat the exact same information that everybody else has. Ask good questions. Well, okay, thanks for that. How exactly do you ask good questions, and what is a good question versus a bad question? I mean, there's no way for you to actually improve your questions if you don't know what is wrong and what is right, what works and what doesn't. So in any case, oh, look, Peg posted the Gene Simmons interview. It is entertaining. So just in case all of you are going to log off right now to go listen to the Gene Simmons interview, I wanted to give you a few exercises that you can do right now. We sometimes neglect the sound of the voice when we're doing keynote speeches or conference panels or podcast interviews or anything like that. So one of the things that we'll be talking about in the course is how to strengthen your voice, how to make your voice more expressive. So I want you to try out humming through an entire script. So if you write your intro and your outro, hum the whole thing all the way through instead of speaking it. That's one way. Another way is to meow all the way, and nobody's going to be listening to you, hopefully, so you don't have to worry about being embarrassed. But meow your entire way through your script and see how those go. There's a few other exercises as well that we're going to talk about, things that you can do, and those are going to last you way longer than the 8-week course. In fact, all of this stuff should last you for years and years and years. I'm trying to give you the tools that once you leave the 8-week course, you can continue building, and they will still be useful for you 5 years from now, after the 8-week course. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking because I promised to go to questions. All right, so we have like a few minutes left. Are there any questions right now? Anyone who's having an issue with interviews right now that maybe I could answer for you in advance? Okay. One last reminder for you about the course. Registrations are opening this week. It is 8 weeks long. You can find it look at your browser. It says celestehadleymedia.webinarninja.com. Once you register, you will get, they're spaced out, like each one will be available each week. So each week, a new session. You'll get a workbook that you can download and print as many times as you want. Mentioned about how to find people. Yeah, and this is an interesting thing because I went through and tried to see what advice other people were giving in terms of how to find good guests. And the number one most common piece of advice people give is listen to other podcasts that are like yours and call those people. Well, if you do that, I mean, you see the problem, right? Everyone's going to be interviewing the exact same people over and over. So this is going to take longer, Laura, than I can totally explain here on how to find people. One of the things that makes people afraid to talk to amateurs, like you'll find someone who's never been on before, and so you can't hear what they sound like in an interview. One of the things that makes people afraid for that is they think they're going to be terrible and they'll waste their time. There's a few ways that you prevent that, and that's number one, by doing a pre-interview. When you do a pre-interview, again, it's short. It should be 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes if you've really made a connection or have more questions. But a pre-interview with someone like that, you think of it like an audition. Not everybody who auditions gets the part. So a pre-interview can really help you identify new guests and new voices to talk to, because basically anytime you find someone on Twitter who has a fascinating Twitter feed or has written a great blog or has a really, really cool Instagram account, you can actually go and pre-interview them and see if they would be great in your podcast. And most of these things, you can learn to do them so efficiently that they're not going to take you a huge amount of time. Can you do a quick take on what was a big moment that changed how you asked questions? What did you learn? Sure. I mean, this is something I talk about in my book, We Need to Talk, which is that when I took over as co-host of The Takeaway, I wanted to become better at interviews. Mostly because I realized that my interviews, I just felt they were average. I just wasn't getting the kind of in-depth, interesting answers that I wanted. And that's what led me to this field of study, because a lot of the advice that we get is pretty shitty. And it doesn't work. And the reason I know it doesn't work is that I was able to test it out, go back into the studio and try and test each piece of advice I was given and see if it got better responses or didn't. And I know we're over an hour, but I'm going to hang out here and talk a little bit more for anyone who has questions. So, the big moment for me really was when I started looking at studies of cognitive science and neuroscience, and I would take they would study things like the thing I was telling you about of making somebody feel proud, and that I could go and then test in my own studio, and those worked. That actually worked. So, for example, when I get an author in and we're actually in the same place, it was considered gauche, I guess, or inappropriate in the past, or maybe still is, for journalists to ask authors to sign their copy of the book. But I found that when I asked the author to sign the copy of the book, I got a better interview out of them. They were in a better frame of mind, partly because maybe they saw that the book had been read. Maybe they saw my notes in there. I'm not sure. I just know that when I asked authors to sign their book, they were in a better frame of mind to start the interview. So it was those kind of sort of little, I didn't have some big on the road to Damascus moment in terms of asking good questions. It was these little boom, 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 radiant sparks every time I found a study and tested it out and realized it did help. So that assumes we have an audience already. What if we're just starting out? Yeah, this is all going to work for you. And I think it especially works for podcasts that are finding their way, because number one, if you're just beginning, I can help you prevent making mistakes that people make. And one of the biggest mistakes people make is they don't go through the work of making sure they know exactly what their podcast is about, what it's not about, and how it's different from other podcasts. That is going to save you so much time, especially as you choose guests. But in the end, you build your audience because you're so good at that one thing that you do. Keeping in mind that if your podcast can be about anything, in the end, that means it's about nothing. So yeah, all of these things absolutely help to grow your audience. And one of the ways you do that is through pull quotes. Is it because the book signing is a psychological exchange? They are somehow helping you, which makes people more vulnerable. Would that be accurate? I don't know, Peg. It's a good theory. This particular thing has never been studied. I am not an academic at a research institution where I could put this to the test. But it's a good question. I would think that partly is in line with the idea of helping someone feel proud of asking that question. What's the best thing that's happened to you? What's the best thing you've done this year? I think it's kind of in line with that. I'm going to push my podcast options. Great. That's awesome. Because I do think I can save you a lot of time. And the reason I can save you a lot of time is I have 21 years behind me of making mistakes. I have made all the mistakes so that you do not have to. And I know how to, I've screwed everything up. It's funny because I do training on how to be a public speaker also. And people ask me all the time if I get nervous, and I say no, but the reason I don't get nervous is because the worst has already happened. I've done so many speeches that whatever it is that's going to go wrong, I trip and fall, I spill water, the microphone goes out, whatever it is, it's happened. And I lived through it. It's kind of the same thing with interviews. I'm not saying there aren't still mistakes left for me to make. I know that there are, but I've made a lot of them, and I've made them multiple times. So I can try to help you to watch for the yellow flags before you hit the red and sort of prevent you from making some of the mistakes that I and my colleagues have made. I wrote a book called Herd Mentality, which I did interviews with some of the most legendary people in public radio about, and I asked all of them to give me examples of interviews that went badly, and they all had them. All of them had them. How can you save an interview that goes sideways? It depends, Peg, because it depends on, that's sort of covered in the handling difficult guests. It depends on what it is that's caused it to go sideways. Is there arguing? Are they crying? A lot of times we think we want someone to start crying because we think that's going to be great audio. It's very much is not. This is a mistake I have already made. You do not want someone to cry while you're interviewing them. That is a bad idea. So it depends on the particular way in which it has gone sideways, Peg. But you can usually bring it back. Look, I'm not going to blow smoke up your hind end. There are some interviews that are not salvageable. It's just going to happen. But if right now, that's true of like 2 in 10. I mean, frankly, I hear a lot of interviews and most of them are not great. They're just average. They're just okay. And it's a waste. It's a wasted opportunity because there's nothing wrong with most of the hosts. They absolutely can do better interviews and turn those okay interviews into great interviews, the kind of interviews that get attention. There are interviews that are so good in which you get a guest to say something new and unexpected, and you get headlines. Reporters will write about it. Now, if you want to talk about building an audience, that's one of the ways that you can do that. Book a good guest or a good thinker and have them say something that makes headlines. That's absolutely doable. Are there other questions? I know we're past your time. I'm respectful of your time. I don't want to keep you too long. Okay, so I didn't even realize there was these down here. So I'm going to close out the webinar right now. I do put these webinars up on my YouTube channel. Do you generally advise against silence and breathing space? Sometimes it can feel, oh, you're absolutely correct, Barbara. And this is one of the things that we talk about is using silence. You know, this is interesting. One of the places I read the most about this particular technique, using silence, it was out of law enforcement and CIA manuals, because silence is so uncomfortable for people. The reason why detectives use silence is because people rush to fill the silence. And so they'll just start talking, and they'll end up telling you things they may not have intended to tell you. So absolutely, you can use silence strategically and beautifully in a way that doesn't sound calculated, but in a way that really helps people open up. I'm in grad school program right now. Are you interested in working with schools to bring parts of this? Yeah, I absolutely, I can do that. And this is one of the great things, that's because I finally had the time to sit down and turn this into a training course. The curriculum is now done. So yeah, I would love, I want to teach as many people as possible some of these techniques, because there's no need to have terrible interviewing skills. It's unnecessary. We don't need to do it anymore. Anyway, thank you guys all for being here. It's always a blast. I'm always willing to talk about this stuff. One last reminder that we are taking registration. I'm taking registrations. This has been over a year in the works for me. And it was the pandemic that allowed me to finally finish it all. But it is an 8-week course. It really drills down on every single part of the interview, plus your workbook, plus once a month, twice over the course of the 8 weeks. I'll sit down with you and have a conversation like this in which we can address your questions and really dig into things. Thank you guys all for coming. Have a great day. Have a great Thursday. And hopefully I'll see you guys in the master series. It's called Transform Your Interviews 8-week course. Bye.